clean coal. You've heard a lot about it, so let's take a tour of this state-of-the-art clean coal facility. Amazing! The machinery's kind of loud, but that's the sound of clean coal technology. And while burning coal is one of the leading causes of global warming, the remarkable clean coal technology you see here changes everything. Take a good long look. This is today's clean coal technology.
Humanities scholar Clay Jenkinson condemned this ad in his weekly column in the Bismarck Tribune, calling it misleading and a naked piece of propaganda. He also challenged North Dakota and the energy industry to respond intelligently and forcefully to this fraudulent attack. On his website, Jenkinson further urged the energy industry to hire the best video production company in the world to make a series of ads that explain the truth about coal and presumably the other carbon-based fuels produced in this state, oil and natural gas. It has been more than 7 years, and the energy industry still hasn't acted on this suggestion. Well, I guess we are it. However, this production is a bit more ambitious than a 30-second ad.
Few challenges facing America and the world are more urgent than combating climate change. The science is beyond dispute and the facts are clear.
We feel like there was a trial, and someone was tried and convicted without a fair hearing. We are told the verdict was unanimous. Now there is a rush to execute the judgment, and it all seems like one big, terrible mistake. It is a little difficult for us to speak out now. We are but common citizens. We have our jobs to do and families to take care of. What do we know about global warming and climate change? And it is difficult to have sympathy for the co-defendants in this case. One is an odorless and colorless gas, a molecule comprised of one atom of carbon and 2 atoms of oxygen. And the other is the big bad fossil fuel industry that produces the oil and coal, the burning of which emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. To some degree, big oil and big coal, and the energy industry in general, may deserve their negative reputations. But how did a completely natural substance become so demonized? Try doing a Google search on the words CO2 and spew, and you get over 80,000 hits. Most of them give the impression that CO2 is some kind of noxious pollutant being dumped into the atmosphere. And in fact, the Environmental Protection Agency has declared CO2 to be a dangerous pollutant. It is also difficult to speak up now because we are told that the case against CO2 was overwhelming and that there is near universal consensus as to its guilt. What then could be the reasons why the case against CO2 should be reopened? We think there are 2 pretty compelling reasons. The first is CO2 did not get a fair trial. Quite simply, the trial was rigged. There was plenty of evidence which cast doubt on the global warming hypothesis. But much of this evidence was suppressed or ignored. Evidence which made CO2 look guilty was manufactured. Even worse, our investigation found that the trial process was rife with prosecutorial and judicial misconduct. Second, there is new evidence that exonerates the defendant. In a rational system of justice, if any one of these is present, a new trial should be granted. But rationality seems to be in short supply these days.
It won't happen overnight, and it will require some tough choices along the way. But the debate is settled. Climate change is a fact. And when our children's children look us in the eye and ask if we did all we could to leave them a safer, more stable world with new sources of energy, I want us to be able to say, yes, we did.
The present administration, the dominant media culture, and the various power elites in this country have a closed mind on the matter. So it is up to us, common citizens though we are, to reopen the case against CO2. But before we do, let's give you a little background and explain why we have the audacity to retry this case. We live and move and have our being in southwest North Dakota. North Dakota lies in the heart of the upper Midwest, part of what is known as flyover country to those who live in the east and west coasts. North Dakota is primarily an agricultural state known for rolling plains, farms, blizzards, floods, lots of empty space, unique roadside attractions, and its recent Bakken Formation oil boom. North Dakota's population is estimated to be around 750,000, and even with the population increase associated with the energy boom, it is still only ranked 47th among the states in population. The state's population peaked in the 1930s. Since then, the story has been one of decline and stagnation until the recent energy boom. This decline was most acute in the rural areas and very small towns. In addition to all the wheat, beef, and potatoes, we exported people. We did a good job of rearing our children, instilling in them a solid work ethic, educating them, and then sending them elsewhere to live. While other areas of the country were enriched by this great diaspora of Dakotans, the very small towns which produced this important export were left largely depleted. This natural depopulation of the Dakotas and the Great Plains in general did not go unnoticed. Back in 1987, Professors Frank and Deborah Popper from Rutgers University proposed a government policy which would facilitate the depopulation of the Great Plains, so that this vast and relatively empty expanse could be turned into a huge nature preserve. This proposal was dubbed the Buffalo Commons, and our little town was the backdrop for an interview Popper gave to NBC News back in the late 1980s.
Assignment Earth tonight, the Buffalo Commons. It's an idea that's been around for a while now, and in the Great Plains, it's not getting to be any more popular. NBC's Roger O'Neill on a plan to give the land back to nature.
He's the crazy professor from the East, Frank Popper. Out west, he's the guy people would like to tar and feather.
We have everything here that you have in a big city, except we have very few of the problems. And so we got something here worth saving, and we're going to save it.
But from North Dakota to Texas, that part of the country called the Great Plains, signs of decay and decline are everywhere. In the most rural areas, Popper says there has been 50 years of population decline. Those left are older and poorer. Water supplies are drying up, and government subsidies, which have always propped up the economy, are disappearing. It's time, Popper says, to seriously consider returning huge chunks of the Great Plains to the buffalo, to the way it was before the settlers came.
We're not telling anybody not to stay. If they can make it out here, terrific. But our sense is if you look at the actual history and economics and demography of the plains, it's always been a hard place to live. It's going to get harder.
There's a lot of prairie patriotism out here, and while some acknowledge some truth in the message, it's the messenger from the east who's being attacked.
I don't understand totally why you pick on the Great Plains.
The history of the Great Plains has always been a story of change, and it continues to be a struggle to survive the harshness of the land. Roger O'Neill, NBC News, Mott, North Dakota.
That's not the news for this Monday night. I'm Tom Brokaw. I'll see you tomorrow night.
And that's the way things were until 2006 or so, when the oil boom started in the Bakken Formation in western North Dakota and eastern Montana. Citizens became excited about the prospect of energy development because of the high-paying jobs it would bring to an area still primarily dependent on agriculture, despite our best efforts at economic development. There were also plans for coal projects at South Hart and the Gascoigne mine in Bowman County. But then we heard that projects were being shelved because of concerns about federal CO2 emissions regulations, and we learned from publications like The Economist that the energy industry in North Dakota faced great uncertainties because of global warming policies. Those of us who noticed felt bad about this turn of events, and even a little angry. A citizen spoke up at a town meeting held by North Dakota Senator Kent Conrad back in August of 2008. He questioned whether North Dakota, being a producer of fossil fuels, should uncritically accept what climate scientists were saying about global warming. Senator Conrad affirmed his faith in climate scientists and climate change and politely changed the subject. The future for energy development in western North Dakota seemed to be in jeopardy after the 2008 election. President Obama had promised an aggressive global warming agenda. 2009 was poised to be the year of decisive action. With majorities in both houses of Congress, the Obama administration wanted sweeping climate legislation in time for the Copenhagen climate talks in December. Copenhagen, the administration hoped, would then result in a global program aimed at drastically cutting CO2. And so, global warming intruded upon life in southwestern North Dakota. We were being asked to make sacrifices for the common good. We believed in the common good. We would have gladly given up the benefits of a robust fossil fuel industry in western North Dakota if it meant saving the planet. But is that really what was at stake? According to major media outlets such as Time magazine, it was. And former Vice President Al Gore conveyed the same urgent message in his Academy Award Nobel Peace Prize winning film, An Inconvenient Truth.
And that is what is at stake. Our ability to live on planet Earth, to have a future as a civilization.
But some things prevented us from taking all this at face value. First, living in the heart of America's Siberia as we do, our intuition told us that global warming can't be all bad. But we could also see right away that global warming science was highly politicized. We constantly heard about the overwhelming consensus on climate change. We saw skeptics compared to Holocaust deniers and flat earthers, and if laypersons dared to question what climate scientists were saying, they were accused of being anti-science. All of this told us that mainstream climate science was profoundly ideological which only heightened our natural skepticism. With regard to the appeals to consensus often made by global warming activists and others, we can only refer you to this quote from a lecture given at Harvard on January 17, 2003, by the late Michael Crichton. I want to pause here and talk about this notion of consensus and the rise of what has been called consensus science. I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. Whenever you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet because you're being had. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What is relevant is reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with the consensus. There is no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period. So we were not deterred by the constant appeals to scientific consensus and scientific authority and accusations of being anti-science. Such rhetoric, whether from scientists, members of the ruling class, or journalists, struck us as elitist propaganda designed to mystify the subject and promote a false consciousness among the common folk in order to keep us in our place. Although the word eco-imperialism hadn't yet entered our vocabulary, that does describe what seemed to be going on. He wanted to keep us in our present state to serve his environmental agenda. So people like Gore stirred in us that rebellious and populist spirit for which there is precedent in North Dakota history. The thought then occurred to us, maybe there are others who don't feel like jumping on the global warming bandwagon. It turned out there were many people who thought Mr. Gore is full of hot air and that the president's war on carbon was unnecessary. Two that we noticed right away were George Carlin and Michael Crichton. Now, what credibility do a comedian and a science fiction writer have on the issue of global warming? Well, enough to give us pause to think. George Carlin could not only be a very funny guy, he was also a very liberal guy in many ways, especially on the subject of free speech. So when someone like that stands up and takes a stand counter to the mainstream, one has to take notice. Michael Crichton had a background in science, having studied anthropology and medicine before becoming a highly successful author. The premise of his novel, State of Fear, was that global warming fears are being greatly exaggerated. And it turned out we had some kindred spirits in our neighboring state of Minnesota.
This is World Headquarters, 1977 Arkansas. Come on in. Hello.
If we had some global warming, if we had some global warming, it wouldn't be 20 below, it wouldn't be 20 below. If we had some global warming, if we had some global warming, I wouldn't be shoveling snow, I wouldn't be shoveling that blasted snow.
Feeling encouraged by people like Carlin and Crichton, and inspired by the Minnesotans for Global Warming and their cheerful skepticism, we launched our own citizens' investigation into the global warming controversy. To be sure, understanding global warming proved to be a daunting task, and on more than one occasion we wondered if we were up to it. In this regard, a great help and encouragement to us was a book by Professor Aaron Waldowski, which is all about empowering the average citizen to evaluate complex scientific issues. And the further we got into our investigation, the more convinced we became of the fallibility of scientists. Scientists are human beings. They burp, they flatulate and pull their shorts on the same as the rest of us. They are subject to all manner of human frailties. They can get their sums wrong. They can be biased. They can be dishonest. They can deceive themselves. They can be motivated by the desire for money, academic success, fame, or just the opportunity to wear really cool hats, get arrested for acts of civil disobedience, and hang out with Daryl Hannah. In a very small town in southwest North Dakota, at the intersection of Highways 8 and 21, is a sign put up by the local fire district. This sign is supposed to tell us about the condition for grass fires. When it is wet, the arrow is supposed to point to low. When it is hot and dry, the arrow should point to fire danger extreme. For some reason, no one bothers to change the arrow, so rain or shine, dry or wet, the sign points to fire danger extreme. On June 6, 2009, just after we all planted our gardens, we had a snowstorm. While the countryside was blanketed in snow, the arrow on the sign was stuck on fire danger extreme. For us, this perfectly captures what has been going on with the global warming controversy. Like our fire danger sign, our experts have failed us. They tell us that CO2 is causing dangerous global warming and a very hot future for our planet, but all the while contradictory facts swirl around in plain sight. This will become abundantly clear as we reopen the trial against CO2.